Hello, we're here with MacDella Cooper. I'm Matt Witenstein, an assistant professor at the University of Dayton, and on behalf of my colleague Radhika Iyengar at the Earth Institute, we've developed this new website that we're excited to engage you with, MacDella, called Power and Praxis, with the idea that our goal is to have a space where folks can actually engage beyond the binary and thinking about gender, but also in taking theory to practice and actually providing video and audio opportunities for people to be engaged in thinking about making decisions and understanding more about ways to engage theory to practice to talk about gender across the globe. And this way, we're able to offer experiences for people to engage with you. So now we get to introduce MacDella will introduce herself.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. It's a great privilege to be here and be a part of this conversation. My work, it's really in this space is to empower women, whatever that may mean, and whether it's through education, it's through helping them create businesses to sustain their own lives and their family lives. We do a lot around women's empowerment. And so I have a foundation that I started in 2003 to do that, to empower women and children. We've been in operation for a few years now. I also wear another hat, which is more on the policy side. So I sort of juggle between being a politician and a philanthropist. And so, I guess in a short form, that's how I introduce myself as an activist, a philanthropist, and a politician.
And the ways we've talked about it over the last couple of hours is really that engagement across all of those, that impact the way you do the work that you do, which is really compelling to us. And so I'm wondering how some of your lived experiences, even if you're thinking back to growing up, whether it's as a refugee and as a child, and how that's anchored and centered sort of your interests in both educational empowerment and involvement, and sort of those sort of those intersections for girls, for women, for kids, just in general.
Yes, it's like I said, in 2003 I started this work because it was so critical at the time. I had left Liberia in the early 90s, migrated to the Ivory Coast, being left behind by my mother, who was in the United States, and my father was killed in a war. Based on my experience during my escape from the civil conflict, moving over to being a refugee, a young refugee, a female refugee in a bordering country, coming over to the United States in the early 1990s, maybe 93. Again, being that young female in Newark, New Jersey, coming over to university, getting my first job in New York City, working in the fashion industry at the time, that opened my eyes to a new reality during the different stages. And when I started the MacDella Cooper Foundation back in 2003, I saw the need to go back and educate women and children, because I realized that women and children had they experienced the most atrocities during the civil conflict. And I was lucky. As a young girl, I wasn't raped, I wasn't killed. A lot of my young colleagues were raped. They were taken as sex slaves. The young boys were taken to fight. Some young girls were taken to fight as well. But for the most part, girls were the ones who were cooking for the rebels. Girls were the ones who were being used as sex slaves. Girls and women suffer a great deal during the war. And so when I started my work, I saw the need to empower women and girls. And I did it based on the experiences I had as a young woman growing up and escaping a civil war and coming to this country and eventually going back to Africa and seeing women and girls still being left out of the equation. When it came to education, there were more boys in school than girls. There were more women, there were more males in the corporate spaces in the political landscape than females. less female were involved in decision making across the board. And same with young people as well, but I'm going to focus more on women. And so I saw the need to push women forward. How does that start? What does it look like? If we're going to push women forward, we need to have more educated women. So when it comes to decision making, they're making, educated decisions. And so this is sort of how we model our approach to empowering women, getting the education piece together first, and then when they're ready, when they're equipped, get them to be a part of the decision making. Because you can't just take a woman who's not equipped and put her there to make decisions. It'll be a disaster, and that's not what we want. We want equipped, educated, abled women to be a part of the decision making of any policy or any country or any continent.
So it sounds like it's an engaging process in which there's actually support. Instead of just providing an education, it's more about providing a broader education to actually support.
Yes, absolutely. On different levels.
Right.
If the young girls who are not educated, we first try to engage with their families to get them on board of the education piece. But they also have to put in the protection aspect. A lot of young girls in developing countries and third world countries are governed by traditions and religion. So their lives are entirely governed by the family's tradition, the national tradition. Young girls are still experiencing a great deal of FGM. They have to go to these societal places to learn how to become a young woman. And so they're forced to get cut, something that is causing a lot of young women to experience death even at some point. They go through a great deal of pain, medical, conditions where they can't have children, or childbearing becomes painful to them. So there are a slew of things that a young girl will go through. So adding the education piece, engaging with the families, asking the families permission to put them into a school where we take responsibility of the burden from the families. Because the families put these young women through these atrocities, they hope that it'll be easier for them to find a husband who would then take over the responsibility. So there are a lot of traditional social religion.
It's cyclical.
It's absolutely.
It is, and part of the unhinging of that binary might even be engaging with family to
Absolutely.
Sort of break some of that.
Absolutely. That's why it's critical for us to engage with families and let the family, and sometimes you will not believe it, but the families will actually give you permission as long as you're willing to take over the responsibility. It's all because on the government level, governments, at least in my specific country, they do not have enough resources to provide social services for these communities. So the communities are left on their own to fend for themselves. So it's primarily economic as well as policies that are not in place. And so engaging the families, ensuring them that we will be responsible, but we can't do this for every child in the country.
Yeah.
So imagine those girls that are not being reached. And so these girls grow up into women. They go through this societal, rite of passage.
Right. Life cycle.
Life cycle. They get married early. Their husbands take responsibility, but sometimes the husbands are not necessarily equipped to take over these responsibilities. And so these girls go through abusive situations. They become women mothers who then find themselves in this predicament. And so it's a lot happening with the women that we support. And I know it happens in other countries. There's a lot that we look at and see how we can ease these girls from this sort of line of that this is sort of a vicious cycle.
Right.
We want to break them out of these vicious cycles. And sometimes without the education piece, these young women grow up thinking that this is the norm. And for them, it is the norm.
It is.
But in order to, for the women's movement or the women's suffrage to have a greater impact, we have to have less women in the world who think that that's the norm. It is not the norm. And I'm not trying to bring Western ideology to my region, but there's a universal responsibility on women like me who have come from that background into a more global background now, or global setting. We have to go back and say, you know what, that is infringing on these young women's human rights. And so this is why I go with these ideologies to my community, to my village, and say, well, I'm not trying to impose Western ideologies in my rural setting, but I'm just bringing ideologies that are more global, universal. To say a young girl should have access to education, a woman should have access to health care, and a woman should have access to finances. She has to have finances. She can't just live based on what her husband gives her per day to survive, but she has to have her own finances. And so these are no longer Western ideologies. This is just a universal ideology. And so we try to push this piece from that end. Has also, we're working with women in the Western world, in the more developed parts of the world, to see to it that women are on the tables when it comes to decision making. And so we're pushing from both angles.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So it sounds like in many ways what you're saying is that it is not normal. We're disrupting what society has created, these social reproductions of the binary of gender. Yes. We weren't born to be into roles. Society has developed and created that. And earlier when we were talking about some of those intersections between gender and religion, and other different patriarchal sort of systems.
That's right.
And it sounds like you're trying to break some of those systems.
That's right.
Because they're not necessarily, the way you're talking about it, natural. They've been created and developed.
That's right. That's right. Society has said, people, I guess, opinion leaders and decision makers have sat and say, this is what we expect the women should do. This is what we expect the men to do. And we're saying no, as long as the person is equipped, as long as the individual is ready, they can play the role they feel, called to play.
To make decisions about their own life and have agency.
Absolutely.
And so one of the questions I have for you that we were talking about earlier and that Power and Praxis is really interested in, just our whole idea through this is thinking about empowerment and what that actually means, and understanding maybe how you explain empowerment. And some of the words that got us excited that you were talking about earlier were also engagement, involvement, and maybe even making, sort of what we've been thinking about is being clear on what does that actually mean, and how does that actually play out in local contexts. And maybe you can even share how you've seen that play out in local contexts in Liberia.
Sure. It's a lot of people talk about women's empowerment, but what does it really mean to empower a woman? I think when you look at the local women in the villages and the communities I work on the ground in Liberia, let's say, for example, these women just want tools, the resources to better off their lives. A lot of them has missed the mark of going to get traditional education. So it's too late now to go back to school, to start from first, second grade, and go to 12th grade and go to university. They've missed out on that part. Yeah. But now they're of age. A lot of them they're mothers, and they have this responsibility of a family. And so they have to, they usually try to figure out how to survive. They start small businesses. And for me, that's empowering for me, where you can give a woman something that gives her finances. Because with finances, she can make better decisions for her family.
Especially in a global context.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. So when we talk about women's empowerment, I try to think of it as, okay, let's give her the tools that she needs. Of course, no one in the world is responsible for anyone else, but at least if government cannot do it, we, the philanthropists, the humanitarians, would come in and say, like BRAC USA, for example, not to promote any one company, but these loan companies come in and give you small loans to start a business. A woman can start an informal business that brings her cash flow so that in the morning she can decide what her kids are going to eat, what school they're going to go to, how they're going to get themselves to school and back. And she can decide what outfit she's going to wear and what level of abuse she's going to take from her partner. So there's a lot that she can resolve in her own life. And once those issues are resolved, she can then get in the community and help out other women and other children and help build her community. But without empowering her on an individual basis, it's difficult for her to empower her children or her daughter. Then she has to find these informal ways of taking care of her daughter. And so the vicious cycle continues. But if she's in power, she stops the vicious cycle in her own family lineage or life. And so for me, getting involved with this woman, giving her the tools, seeing to it that she understands her role to herself as well as her family. And that's part of the education piece that we do. We teach women their responsibility to themselves as well as their family. And some of the education we do is if you're not equipped financially to take care of a child, try to avoid bringing one into the world. Don't depend on someone else to take care of you. Basic things like that. And so we tell women across the board, whether they're educated or uneducated, they must first understand their role to themselves. And then their families, their children, and their communities, and their country. And believe it or not, once these women understand their role, or at least not according to me or anybody else, but just, hey, you are called to do something greater than, just washing someone's clothes or being, a second-class citizen, whatever way you would describe that. Once we get them to understand that they have some part to play in this global universe, they feel empowered. Yeah. And the next step is to give them those tools. It's important. So when people talk about women's empowerment, it's not just about hosting a conference to have women listen to you, but it's also going beyond that and helping her fully equip herself. When a woman is equipped, the sky's the limit for her. And that's why you see the imbalance in our world today. When women do not have the tools, they then become dependent. And being a dependent, it's oftentimes something that should be designated for children. Being a dependent, not a grown-up adult.
Who has agency to make decisions about their own life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, most women go into early marriages because they're looking for tools to take care of their lives. They don't necessarily just want to get married, but they just want to be in a place where they can be fed and housed and clothed. And those are things that we on the policy side should put mechanism in place so that people can be empowered, not to just necessarily jump into a marriage where they don't want to be in. Again, that's a whole separate topic, but I think a lot of women understand this piece because it is their reality, it's their daily reality. They go from being at father's house to going to a husband's house, but never having that time in between to grow as an individual, to figure out themselves and how and what they're called to contribute to our global universe before going to be someone else's caregiver.
And part of what Radhika and I are trying to work on through this idea, through this power and praxis piece, is really understanding how we can sort of work in a participatory way with women and girls to consider what are some of the things they value so that we can understand how to combine some of the tools you're talking about with how they may see the world in their place and their space. And it's so interesting to think about how we tend together with some of the maybe some of the expertise they have with some of the expertise we have to help build sort of this understanding of the agency that they may be desiring and tending to that to maybe to enlighten them in ways that they may be able to use it.
Yeah. I think a lot of women that we engage with, they know very much what they want to do. And like I said, once you start the conversation piece with them, they will tell you, I want to start my own business, or I want to go back to school, or I want to become a nurse, or whatever it is. But it's women in developing countries, really, if any empowerment must start with helping them fine-tune their skills, those who have aged out of traditional school, schooling, and they can't go back, helping them, through job and skill training, to help them fine-tune the skills so that once they are given those small loans and to start a business, the business becomes successful because they all have dreams. Everyone, all these.
Everybody has aspirations.
Aspiration, absolutely.
The goal is how do we support people in knowing that they actually can, in some ways, play that out and have agency to make more decisions. It sounds like in some way you're just saying.
Absolutely. Those of us who are in a given space, we should focus on giving them tools that they need to live out the dreams that they are called to live.
And so, speaking about that, I'm curious what advice that you might have for community members, largely to those maybe who have more privilege, as in particular, to support your vision, maybe in practical ways. That could be policy ways, they could be philanthropic ways, it could be in any ways that you're seeing, to actually to involving women in more action-oriented and agency and decision-making roles, whether it's in their community, in their family, or even on a more global scale.
Absolutely. I've had a young woman who was working at one of my institutions, my school, and she was teaching a kindergarten class. And eventually she came up to me and said, Miss Cooper, I would love the opportunity to go back to school. And she won this scholarship through another organization. She went back to school, and we kept her daughter for her. She had a young daughter who was with her at the school. And I shared this story because she's now returning to her job, but more equipped, ready to give back in a bigger way.
Yeah.
And now this is someone who I feel that if we were to ask her to do something bigger, like maybe start another branch of the school in a different community, she's now equipped to do that because she went out better off herself. So women, like I said, I keep repeating this over and over, they know very well what it is they want to do. So for example, like my story of me coming from Liberia, going through the civil crisis, and going into exile in the Ivory Coast, having an opportunity to come to the United States to obtain an education. With that privilege, I was able to better off myself, to go back to my community and give back, to my country and give back. And so the empowerment piece is very important, and that's why I think we focus so much on the 360 aspect of empowerment, which is, yes, we focus on taking the girls out of the communities. We focus on educating them, but also at the hopes of them going back to give to the next generation or to the next group of young women that are going to be coming up. So the giving back piece is very important because I think that's the overall purpose for what we're trying to do. We want to build this ecosystem of women building their own communities, women taking or making decisions around their own existence. But I know it's a little difficult in these developing countries because we don't have the policy piece behind enforcing education for all, including girls. Most countries I've worked in, especially my country, boys get the opportunity to go to school first before the girls. And so, but when we educate enough women now, it will become a norm so that the policy piece, as we're working with governments to put in the policies,
It's key, isn't it?
it's key. It's essential.
And so one of the things that I find compelling about this whole piece as it relates to policy, as it relates back to the idea that you were talking about a few minutes ago, about actually engaging with women in local communities, about understanding what they desire, and sort of working in this participatory sort of format that Radhika and I have been working at, which relates back to this whole power and praxis piece.
Yeah.
Is actually figuring out how do we engage with women and understanding what they want to actually filter policy back up,
Yeah.
so that policy actually reflects what women are interested in and how that best supports their communities versus policy being only developed from a more patriarchal sort of lens that may not work with supporting them. So for example, you might be sending you might be sending more women back to school, but unless you create policies
That's
that
right.
are supporting both skilled labor
right.
and other types of opportunities that empower and engage women throughout the whole fabric of society, how is that helping? So my question to you, as a policy person, and then let me preface by saying Radhika and I are really interested in sort of bottom-up policy and filtering that policy back this way. Is how do you see supporting women's political aspirations connected to your education mission for gender and employment and all of those kinds of things?
That's a beautiful question. And it's one that I take personally because in order to have the policy piece really in action, or at least implemented or created, I believe that it's my responsibility. So one of the things I do is to get more women interested in politics.
Yeah.
Because when they become local representation in parliament or in Congress, they can push bills that will then become these bills and these policies. And so we. But again, it's like a cycle in a way. You got to have the educated women ready to go into politics, right? That would then help push the bills and policies. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
So another thing along with that I find compelling, you mentioned in an article that you had been in an interview with in the Atlantic that you aspire to be the education and development president
That's
of
right.
Liberia.
That's right.
And so one takeaway that I think would be really, really compelling for development workers, local community stakeholders, policymakers, politicians, and academics to take what can those folks do and take from your sort of lived experiences and policy perspectives to support their work in Liberia and in other developing countries?
Well, I always say that philanthropists are people who step in where government fails. It is not philanthropists' responsibility to go and run a community project or build roads or hospital. Of course, you do it as a temporary solution, but then government has to have policies and that will see to it that these communities are served and have all of the clinics, the schools, the roads, the transportation. That's government's responsibility. And so when philanthropists come in, they're just trying to help temporarily. But then you find in countries like mine, where when a philanthropist group or humanitarian group come in, they become the sustaining power of that community. And it's not the way it should be.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, if I should potentially become, I was running for office at the time, and so that's why I made that statement. I want to see to it that we in government, politicians, understand their role to its people and the communities and the country. It is nobody else's responsibility but government to see to it that people have the tools. The roads should be built. The hospitals should be built. The schools should be there. Public schools should be available for those citizens who cannot afford private schools. And so that's part of development. That's part of developing a nation. And when you are developing a nation, you're assisting to develop individual lives. Then families can finally send their children to school. A father can potentially have a job to take care of his family. So government's not responsible for doing that. And same as a mother. So creating avenues for people to have the tools they need to take care of themselves and their families. And so I wanted to become that development person because my focus is development. If you develop the country, the people will help themselves. They will develop themselves.
It seems like in some ways, nation building can work from the bottom up.
Absolutely.
And if we understand what our citizens actually need from the diverse communities in which we're in, it sounds like from what you're saying.
Absolutely.
We might be able to create a stronger nation building. And so I have two last questions that sort of go together, and it beautifully worked with this idea of nation building that you talk about. How might we think about policies from the bottom up in your mind to inform decisions about how education and economic policies can best support citizens in nation building?
Yeah, it comes from the representatives of the local community. A local community sending its representative to the House of Parliament should be able to go to Parliament to advocate on the community's behalf because every community is different. And so without the local leadership, and women are the best. I'm sorry to say, I sound like a real hardcore feminist, but I am.
That's a good.
Women are mothers in the community. They know the children. They're producing their children. They know what's going on because they're primarily a caregiver of the community and the families. And so I push women in politics because I think they'll make great representation in Parliament. Absolutely. And great advocates for community because they know the children has to go to school at a certain age. When they need their medical attention, when the roads and the buses are not working. And so we need leaders. I'm not suggesting male cannot do that. But
But that women need to have their participatory voice.
absolutely, in the process.
And it sounds like as much as local formal leaders should also be women, there are ways. I'm wondering how we should engage women with the formal leaders, whether they're women, and as part of that, within those communities, to actually voice what is needed. And I'm wondering how it'll be interesting to see how we can work together to see how that policy can come up from local communities.
That's right.
Up to sort of this national level to build this sort of, I forgot what you call it, the rule of law, sort of policy that's just sort of generally supporting people.
That's right.
And so my last thought for you as we're talking about nation building, and I'm really excited that we're getting to this towards the end, I'm curious where you envision the next steps for women and girls' rights sort of in this process, and how much we can practically expect in, periods of time. I mean, so my thought always is there's only so much we can do at one time, and we aspire to do so many things.
That's right.
And yeah.
I think now we've lost so much time, and I talk a lot about affirmative action. Now it's time to take affirmative action towards women and girls, because if you just let it be organic, it's never going to work. As you can see, we're in 2018, and women are still not in the decision-making process in a lot of companies, in a lot of community leadership. And so now it's time to put strong laws, rule of law in place, or just policies in place that will demand that women and young people and people of different orientation participate. It's starting in the United States, of course, but other countries still don't have representation from the different communities, especially women. And so now it's time to take that affirm action to put strong policies in place that says, if a woman is not in parliament, we have to have a certain, in my country, for example, they say 30-70. There should be 30% women if they're 70% men. But then 30% women also includes young people, people of different physical ability, and people of different orientation. So the women bracket just become much smaller then. And so today we have a government that has maybe one or two women represented in government.
Wow.
And that's a disgrace, in my opinion. And I say that proudly without any reluctancy because it should not be happening in 2018. So a country like my country, for example, we have got to put strong laws in place that says there should be no government operation except we have that 30% women represented. It's not just by conversation anymore, it's by action.
Yeah.
And that's what you talk about. How do we then bring practice into it? It is how you get practice into it. It is how you expect government, and especially a country like mine that depends on foreign aid. I would just appeal to our foreign development partners and say there should be no money coming to this country except women are participating in the decision making as to how the funds are being used. So we're not just spending money on buying fancy cars for government officials, but yes, the women don't have a safe place to give birth, or young people don't have a place to go to obtain an annual visit to the doctor. And so these are the affirmative action policy piece that must be implemented now. We can no longer sit back and be diplomatic about it. At least that's what I do. I'm not diplomatic about these things anymore because we're losing too many potentially good people that are missing out on the education piece at the right age. They're growing into adulthood. They're going to these forced marriages. I'm not knocking marriages. Marriages are great. They're fantastic. But people should go into the institution for the right reason, so the institution can remain sustainable. And so you have these women who are...
That's a good point.
Yes, absolutely. You have these women who are just trying to find a way out of a system that doesn't support them.
So it sounds like if tying together a lot of the ideas about what is empowerment in some of the ways you're talking about, first of all, it needs to be sustainable, right?
Absolutely.
Whatever, you've talked about engagement, involvement, decision-making power. In some ways, we talked earlier in our conversation about incivility and disruption.
That's right.
And actually causing incivility and disruption to actually have more capability to engage in discussions and inform policy.
That's right.
And you mentioned sustainability at the end. Without making those changes sustainable, then we're always going to be in this flux of going back and forth.
Absolutely. So we need government participation. We need, when we talk about women's empowerment, we talk about women's involvement. We need to educate the male counterparts. We need to educate our institutions to be more open to receiving women participation. And so there's a whole education piece that's taking place that needs to continue, that needs to be supported. I have a school, and I started a school for children in Liberia. It was originally started for girls, but then I thought we need to educate the boys. So we brought in the boys, because we can't say empower the girls, and leave the boys uneducated. In terms of, you have to understand, a woman can fully participate just as you can. This is a shared universe that we can share this universe and coexist and share responsibilities. It's no longer just a male responsibility to take care of the entire family. The woman is willing and ready to participate. So the young boys growing up needs to understand that as well. And that's what we're trying to do. And so the women who've missed out, we're also educating them. Yes, you have a tradition, you have a religion, you have these cultural practices that says you're a woman, you're supposed to play this role, but also understand, if you, there are beautiful things in these religion, in these tradition and cultural practices that are great, but leave out the things that are not helpful to you and your community. And that's why we stand up against FGM. We stand up against the theories that girls must not be educated like boys. We empower women to understand that she has to equally contribute to her household, just as her partner. So it's we're educating everyone.
And they're educating us together.
Absolutely.
It sounds like, in order to build this sustainable system where women will have greater participation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for chatting. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
We look forward to working further with you.
Absolutely.
As we work on all of our important work.
Absolutely.